When our world feels chaotic, we often look to the past for answers, right? But what if we don't just find historical figures? What if we actually invent them? Today, we're going to dig into one of the wildest examples of this, how the great theologian Karl Barth basically created a brand new John Calvin, one built specifically for a world in total crisis. Okay, just look at this. In 1922, Karl Barth drops this quote about John Calvin, the famous 16th century reformer. A cataract? A demonic power? Absolutely Chinese? What does that even mean? Honestly, this sounds less like a serious theological take and more like something out of a bizarre fever dream. So you gotta ask, what on earth was going on in Barth's head? This wasn't just some random off-the-cuff comment. No, this was a carefully chosen statement. Why would he go out of his way to paint such a strange, almost terrifying picture of a guy he was supposed to admire?
Well, the answer, it turns out, is that this totally bizarre description wasn't an accident in the slightest. It was a strategy. It was all part of the plan.
And get this, Barth pretty much admits it himself. He wanted to freak people out. When he gave his lectures on Calvin, he said he used a menacingly impressive voice. See, his goal wasn't to give some dusty history lesson. It was to literally alarm and disturb his audience, to shake them out of their comfortable, safe little view of the past. Okay, so why all the drama? Why the shock tactics? To get that, we have to understand the world Barth was living in, and it was an absolute pressure cooker. 1920s Germany. Germany in the early 1920s was just chaos. Barth starts teaching in 1921, and the world around him is literally falling apart. I mean, you have political assassinations becoming common, there's social unrest everywhere, and then by 1923, hyperinflation gets so bad that people's life savings become completely worthless, basically overnight. This wasn't just a tough time, it was a society in a state of absolute crisis. And you have to understand, Barth felt this in his bones. He saw his country not as some prosperous nation, but as the biblical beggar Lazarus, sick, poor, and desperate. He was convinced his era was fundamentally broken, and for a broken time, you don't need a gentle history lesson, you need a thunderous prophetic voice to wake you up. So Barth needs this radical, terrifying prophet, but the actual historical John Calvin doesn't quite fit the bill. So what does he do? Well, he builds one, and he uses the intellectual tools of his own cutting-edge modernist era to do it. Turns out, Barth was basically a sponge for all the avant-garde thinking of his day. He was pulling from the literary romanticism of Hermann Hesse, the sociology of Max Weber, the stark existential choices of Soren Kierkegaard, and that raw, prophetic intensity you find in writers like Dostoevsky. He was using a completely modern toolkit to rebuild a figure from the past. And right here, this is the smoking gun. This is the big aha moment. Just look at this comparison. On the left, you've got the novelist Hermann Hesse writing about Dostoevsky in 1919. On the right, Barth on Calvin just 3 years later. Hesse's primeval, occult, Asiatic ideal becomes Barth's primeval forest, absolutely Chinese. It's practically a direct copy. Barth is literally dressing Calvin up in the language of modernism. So, what's with all this talk of Chinese and Asiatic? Well, it plugs right into this big intellectual trend at the time called Orientalism. The idea was that Western thinkers felt their own culture was sick and broken, so they looked to this kind of romanticized, mysterious East for a pure source of wisdom. For Barth, Calvin wasn't just some guy from 16th century Geneva anymore. He was being recast as an alien from a better age, and his very strangeness was the source of his power. Barth also borrowed from the famous sociologist Max Weber, who had written about the Calvinist personality as being really severe and ascetic. Well, Barth took that idea and cranked it up to 11. He reimagined Calvin not as a pastor or a scholar, but as this grim, melancholy Old Testament prophet, like an Elijah or a Jeremiah, sent to call out a corrupt world. And the whole point of this prophetic persona was to force a decision. Barth was pulling from the philosopher Kierkegaard here, arguing that this new Calvin confronts us with a massive either-or. There's no comfortable middle ground, there's no fence-sitting. In a time of crisis, you have to make a radical choice: salvation or destruction, life or death. Okay, so let's put all these pieces together. You take the romanticism from Hesse, the sociology from Weber, the existentialism from Kierkegaard. What kind of figure crawls out of this modernist laboratory? And this is the absolute crucial point here.
Barth's Calvin was not the historical Calvin. Not really. He was a composite character, a brand new creation. He was a thundering prophet, built from all these modernist parts and engineered to speak directly into the soul of an anxious post-World War I society.
So what was this prophet's core message? Well, it was this really powerful 1-2 punch. First comes the devastating no. This is where you have to face the music, the recognition that the human situation is a total crisis, what Barth called the sickness of man unto death. And only after you face that unbearable truth can you hear the yes, the redeeming answer that breaks in from totally beyond, from God, offering a completely new kind of life. You see, for Barth, the solution to the collapse of his world couldn't be found in human politics or culture or progress. No. The answer had to come from another world entirely. And for him, the two words that cut through all the noise and despair were simply Jesus Christ. Now, this whole story is about way more than just one theologian. It really opens up a fascinating window into how modernism actually works. Because it's not always about just breaking with the past. Sometimes it's about radically remixing it.
Here's a great analogy. Think about the composer Igor Stravinsky. He was this huge modernist revolutionary in music. But then, in the 1920s, the exact same time we're talking about, he suddenly pivots to neoclassicism, drawing on all these older musical forms. Just like Barth, he was a radical innovator who reached back into history to create something totally new and avant-garde.
And this whole process has a fantastic name for it, paleomodernism. So unlike the modernists who just wanted to burn everything down, paleomodernists actively go back, they retrieve, and they reappropriate the past. They're basically raiding the treasure house of history to find raw materials for a cutting-edge modern project. And this is really the key takeaway. For guys like Barth and Stravinsky, looking to the past wasn't a retreat from modernism. It was their modernism. The very act of reaching back and remixing history was, in itself, a radical, avant-garde move. All right, so let's just quickly recap what we've learned. Barth's terrifying Calvin was a conscious, modern invention. He used a whole toolkit from his own time, literature, sociology, philosophy, to build him. And it shows us that modernism isn't always about trashing the past. Sometimes it's about radically remixing it for the present. And in the end, this whole story is just a powerful reminder, isn't it? The portraits we paint of historical figures are never just about them. They're also mirrors, and they reflect our own anxieties, our own questions, and the deepest concerns of our own time. Which really leaves us with one final question to chew on. Who are the figures from the past that we're retrieving and remixing today? Who are we refashioning to serve as prophets for our own anxious age?